Arabs began building an empire in 633 AD. Within 67 years, their empire stretched from Spain to Pakistan. It was, at that time, the largest empire on earth ever. There have been empires larger since, but that was, at that point, the largest ever, and it was made really, 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 really fast. The Arabs were not genocidal maniacs, so they weren't like the Spanish or the Mongols. When they conquered a place, they actually showed a shockingly large degree of tolerance, both to the religious practices in the place and then to the cultural differences in that place. So by 750, when the Abbasids take over, the Arab Empire at that point was majority Christian. The vast majority of the population did not speak Arabic. Muslims were the third largest, Islam was the third largest religion in the empire, right? It was this shockingly un-Arab and shockingly un-Muslim entity, political entity. The Arab Empire unravels pretty fast. Within 200 years, chunks of it are breaking away. Within 400 years, it doesn't exist for all intents and purposes. It did exist on paper, but that was really it. It was done. And they break up into these little itty-bitty states ultimately. They're ruled by warlords. One of the problems that the Arabs had was that they weren't really, after they kind of established the empire, they just weren't as keen at sticking to warfare, and so they began doing this thing called a Mamluk. The Mamluk means owned, and what they were is they were slave warriors. And so their army was enslaved. And at one point the army went, has anybody noticed we're the only armed people here? Why are we slaves again? And they eventually rise up and they take over in Egypt and Syria. The empire continues to disintegrate. More and more pieces break off until the Ottomans basically come along and save the day. And they sort of reconstitute the empire. Everything from Morocco to Iraq had transitioned from being mostly not Muslim and not Arab to becoming mostly Muslim and speaking Arabic. So that if you go to Morocco, ethnically, if you take the DNA of Moroccans, they're not Arab. There's probably some Arab blood there, but it's a small amount, 5% max. Same with Algeria, same with Egypt, same with Syria. Syria had a significant Arab population, but the majority of the population wasn't. They were Assyrian, they were Greek, they were Roman, they were Persian. and so what you ended up with was a huge swath of land that spoke Arabic, that had become majority Muslim, but ethnically it wasn't Arab. So culturally it had some similarities to the Arabs, but there were more cultural differences. So that when you say a person is Arab, or you say a state is Arab, or a country is Arab, like in the case of Syria, it's actually kind of a loose thing. Because culturally, there isn't that much in common between Syria and Algeria, frankly. And in fact, the only thing that binds them together is the common language. But if you grabbed a Syrian and dropped him into Algeria and had him start speaking, there would be an immediate language problem because Algerian Arabic is significantly different from Syrian Arabic. So it's a little complicated and a little messy. An empire's successes, the Ottoman Empire wasn't Arab. It was ruled by Turks, but the majority of the land that the Turks ruled was Arab. So it's, again, a little weird because you have this minority Turkish population ruling over this majority Arab population. The Ottoman Empire does very well militarily. It conquers out a huge chunk of land. To be fair, the Ottoman Empire is a made-up term. They didn't call themselves that. They call themselves the Sultanate of Rome. The stated goal of the Ottoman Empire was to recreate the Roman Empire, but it would be a Muslim Roman Empire. And they effectively did that. They conquered a swath of land that was roughly comparable to the Roman empires, but a little bit bigger, and it stretched out into other places that the Romans didn't stretch out into, and was missing the northwest chunk of the Roman Empire. The Ottoman Empire will eventually go into decline, however, because it doesn't keep up with Europe technologically. If you were to go back in time, 500, 600 years, the Ottoman Empire was way ahead of Europe. But by about 200 years ago, the Ottoman Empire is starting to lag behind Europe. Europe has surpassed it in terms of technology and fighting ability. And the Ottoman Empire, by World War I, is in so much trouble, it's lost the vast majority of its territory. At the outbreak of World War I, what the Ottoman Empire had left was the western coast of what is now Saudi Arabia. It had the eastern coast of what is now Saudi Arabia, but not all of it. It had Iraq, what is now Iraq, what is now Palestine and Israel, what is now Syria and Lebanon, and what is now Turkey. At the end of World War II, they're going to lose all the Arabic-speaking chunks, plus about half of the Kurdish land that they own. The Kurds are like Persians. They're in the same cultural linguistic group as the Persians. Persians are also not Arabs. So what ends up happening is the Europeans decide they're going to carve up the Ottoman Empire like a Thanksgiving Day turkey. In fact, they had decided to do this before World War I even broke out. They made a deal, and then they made a sort of secret deal with each other, France and Great Britain, called Sykes-Picot. And they were going to carve off a piece and give it to Greece, carve off a piece and give it to Italy. Another piece was going to go to Russia. They were going to take a piece for themselves, right? They had this really elaborate plan that required all the guys who fought in World War I against Germany and Austria and the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria. It required them to all be on board. And in the end, one of them bails. And the one that bails is Russia, because it has the communist revolution and becomes the USSR eventually. Part of the plan with Sykes-Picot was they were going to cut the Persian Empire in half. And they were going to, the British were going to take the southern half of Persia, and the Russians were going to take the northern half of Persia. And the reason that was important was because Persian oil reserves were in the southwest corner, and Great Britain wanted Persian oil reserves. When Russia goes communist and says it's not going to participate in this, it takes Persia off the list of places that can be conquered because the British can't conquer it by themselves. At that point, the British decide that they want Iraq. Iraq was supposed to go to France, but they know that there's oil in Iraq, especially in northern Iraq, so the British just simply take Iraq. The British are also going to take Palestine, and they're also going to take Jordan, because as far as the Brits are concerned, this is the Crusades coming to fruition, right? They're going to get Jerusalem, finally. Right, because in the Third Crusade, the one that King Richard the Lionhearted goes on, they don't retake Jerusalem. So this is the way England gets to kind of complete that story. They're finally going to get Jerusalem. Iraq goes into a state of rebellion the same year, 1920, because it doesn't want to end up as part of the British Empire. And the British actually bomb Baghdad. They actually launched the world's first ever aerial bombardment of a major city. And they bomb Baghdad, trying to force the Iraqis to submit. It's not the first aerial bombardment of a city. It's the first airplane aerial bombardment of a city. In World War I, the Germans were actually sending dirigibles over London, and they would have a guy in a basket take bombs, arm them, and throw them out the basket. So that was great, I'm sure. And by the way, it's not the first aerial bombing. It's the first aerial bombing by airplane of a city. The first aerial bombing was during the Mexican Revolution in 1912, I believe, was the first time they used aircraft. It was actually in Mexico. Mexico did that first. How cool is that? In any case, Iraq eventually does submit. Since we're all adults here, I'm going to quote Prime Minister David Lloyd George. There was a public outcry against the idea of bombing Baghdad. Like, it was just offensive to so many people. Nobody could believe that the British were doing it. And David Lloyd George got up in front of Parliament and said, "Great Britain reserves the right to bomb." So in case you didn't know, according to the British, Iraqis are Africans that can be slurred in this negative way. Can you imagine the racism today? Like if the president got up and said, "We have the right to bomb these people because they're..." In any case, Iraq will submit, just as Syria did. In fact, the twisted irony is the king of Syria, the guy who's trying to create this kingdom, his name is Faisal. Faisal the First. He was the king of the kingdom of Hijaz. If you watch the Lawrence of Arabia movie, he's Alec Guinness. So right, he's Obi-Wan Kenobi. When the British realize he's unemployed now because he's just lost Syria, they offer him to be the king of Iraq, and he becomes the king of Iraq. So he will become the puppet for the British as they try to rule Iraq. There's something seriously wrong with Iraq and Syria. First of all, they're fake. They're made up. They don't exist. The word Syria has been around for thousands of years. That's not made up. But the word Iraq is so made up, we don't actually know where the British came up with it. There's some speculation that they came up with it from Uruk, which was one of the ancient Mesopotamian city-states. Could be. Another possibility is it's an ancient Arabic word for riverbank. That could be too. We don't know, because the British never wrote down how they came up with the name Iraq. They just made it up. Just boof, there it is. They're like Adam in the Garden of Eden, only this isn't the Garden of Eden. And the border that they create between these states, that's also arbitrarily drawn. If you'll notice in the top right on this map, there's sort of a, what color is that? It's beige, I don't know. That's Kurdish-ruled part of Iraq. But the Kurdish-ruled part of it goes across. You see where Kobane is? It's the big green circle, because we were bombing the hell out of the area around it. That's what the circles are, is our bombing campaign. That's also Kurdish, and then where it says Hasaka, to the right of that and up, that's also Kurdish. And what happened was the Kurds ended up getting divided. Kurds living in Iran, and then Kurds living in Turkey. In other words, they just dropped the border. Who knows how they drew it? They were probably drunk. They had a crayon and a map of the area, and they just like, hey, let's put it here. And they did this deliberately, cutting the Kurds up because they wanted to deny the Kurds from ever having a state. That part they weren't drunk for. But for the rest of it, like, how did they get that really weird straight line that's the southeast border of Syria, right? And then Jordan, how did they even decide to make a Jordan? Like, what was that about? It's a tiny population, mostly desert. Like, what was the point in making it even? And the reality is that the Europeans weren't about trying to make good borders for the people that lived there. They were about dividing and conquering. They dropped borders into the Middle East that would effectively mess the Arabs up and prevent their long-term goal of unifying. Now, in the case of this part, the goal was to unify and create a single Arab kingdom in what is now the Asian part, what is the Asian part of the Arab world. Having said that, right around the same time period, 1919, riots break out in Cairo. They actually break out in Meydan Tahrir, which, if you follow the Arab Spring you realize that was the center of the Arab Spring in Egypt in 2011, and then 2012 and 2013. And it was true in 1919 also. There's something about Meydan Tahrir. If you ever go to Egypt, you'll kind of see it. There's something magical about that spot. In 1919, the reason the Egyptians are rebelling is the same reason that the Irish are rebelling, and it's the same reason that Gandhi is in the act of rebellion. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to break the British Empire up. The Indians and the Irish and the Egyptians are communicating, they're talking to each other, they're trying to coordinate their protest activities. Ireland's trying to get independence, Egypt's trying to get independence, India's trying to get independence. India and Ireland were working so well together that they actually decided to make the same flag, right? You just take the Irish flag and tip it over, and you've got the Indian flag if you stick a wheel in the middle. That's not an accident, that was on purpose. Egypt wasn't that interested in sharing a common flag, but they were definitely sharing tactics. And in the 1919 riots in Cairo, Egypt, something amazing happened. So Egypt at the time was about 25% Christian. Its Christian minority has been shrinking as a portion of the country dramatically over the last 100 years. It's probably about 10% today. So it went from 25 to 10 in about 100 years. That 25% Christian population, they're called Copts. C-O-P-T, Copt. And then if there's a bunch of them, they're Copts. But it sounds like I'm saying Copts. I'm not, I'm saying Copts. Anyway, the Coptic population of Egypt decided to create a new ideology. And that ideology is called Pan-Arabism. All of Pan-Arabism is to replace the joke states, because they're jokes. To replace UAE and Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Tunisia and Algeria and Morocco, all the joke states, Syria, Iraq, with one single political entity that would stretch from Morocco to Iraq. And they wanted to call it the United Arab Republic, and they wanted it to be secular, and they wanted it to be socialist. And that ideology is part of the reason Egypt is in a state of rebellion in 1919. The rebellion is so far blown, in fact, by 1920, the same year that the Irish are going to get independence, the Egyptians get virtual independence from the British Empire. They're not fully independent, but it's a step in the right direction as far as they're concerned. Everybody is excited about what happens in Egypt. India, of course, is still years out, because when India started to go violent, Gandhi backs off. He goes, no, we're not going to do this violently, we're going to do this non-violently. But the Irish and Egyptians were okay with the violence, so they get their independence. Germany takes out France really fast. Really, France is defeated in the first 2 weeks. It takes them about another 4 weeks to admit it, because they're stubbornly holding on, but they were done fast, right? Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel put the French down in this amazing flanking maneuver that's just mind-boggling, and France is forced to surrender. And when France surrenders, the Germans make a strange deal with the French. The Germans are basically going to have the Atlantic coast of France. They're not annexing it. It doesn't become part of Germany. It's going to be a German occupation zone. And the reason is to prevent the English, and if later on the Americans get in a war, to prevent them from invading France. France then gets the Mediterranean interior, basically. And what they do is they take the town of Vichy, and they make that the new provisional capital. By the way, the new premier of France was the hero Pétain of World War I. He was the general who was the hero for World War I. And the Vichy French are on paper officially allies of Nazi Germany now. So France has effectively changed sides at that moment. Now it's on paper, because the French aren't really on board. So even though France is willing to do stuff to sort of get by during the Nazi occupation, at the end of the day, they're also doing a lot of foot dragging and sabotage. This means for the British is they've got a problem, because their territory, so they've got Palestine and Jordan and Iraq, their territory to their northwest, Syria, is technically now a German ally. And so the British decide not to wait to figure out what the Vichy French are going to do, and they invade Syria. And it's actually a really bloody affair, but we don't think of it much, in part because it's not the cool stuff. The cool stuff, of course, isn't going to happen until after the United States gets in the war, because we don't care about anybody else. So there's that. But then the other thing is that the British completely suppressed all the news coming out of Syria and didn't allow it to get to Britain, because they didn't want the British to know that they were having this weird issue. And so what should have been probably an interesting World War II theater of operations is sort of lost to history a little bit. When the British take over Syria, they don't know what to do exactly, right? Because they got to keep the Syrian population happy, because they don't want them to rebel, especially because right in the middle of all of this, Iraq goes into a state of rebellion and Syria merge. It's called the United Arab Republic. And it doesn't last. It only lasts 3 years. At the height of its membership, it included Egypt, the Sudan, the Yemen, and Syria. Having said that, Sudan breaks away almost right away, and then in 1961, Syria declares its independence. And the reason was, in all fairness, because Nasser treated the Syrians really badly. He just was not good at ruling Syria. He wasn't fair with the Syrians. He constantly alienated them. He did not trust them. He probably shouldn't trust them, because he had alienated them so badly that he shouldn't trust them, right? It was like this terrible feedback loop. And finally, in 61, Syria secedes from Egypt and says, but we're not done. If you guys straighten out your act and can treat us right, we're ready to join into a union with you again. Like on the Syrian end, it wasn't an angry secession. On the Egyptian end, it didn't feel very amicable. Having said that, in 1958, when Syria and Egypt merge, something else has also happened. Iraq